Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tools and beyond the headlines. As we speak, the Democrats are hoping to pass a $1.75 trillion spending package. The so-called Build Back Better program comes on the back of another $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill passed last week. On the face of it, it's a remarkable achievement for a president who has not yet spent a year in office, but not a bit of it. Biden has one of the lowest approval ratings for a president at this stage, and Democrats fear there's a lot worse still to come in next year's midterms. So what's going wrong? To explore all of this, we're joined again by our US election team. We've got Malcolm Brown in Virginia. Hello, Malcolm.
Hey, Nick.
Good to see you. There's a lot happening in Virginia. We'll come to that in just a second. We've also got Professor Tom Baldino, Emeritus Professor of Politics from Wilkes University in Wilkes, Pennsylvania. Hello, Tom.
Hello.
Great to have you both with us. Very much looking forward to this. It's going to be a packed hour. Malcolm, just to start with, just to sort of, do a recap, what's in these huge spending programs? What are they? And what opposition have they met in Congress?
Well, this is the kind of the social environment. It's a bit of a grab bag, basically. It's the sort of the social, environmental. There's some climate stuff in here. Obviously, a lot of stuff. We're talking over $1 trillion, as you mentioned. And this was meant to be progressives in the Democratic Party wanted this married to the infrastructure legislation because they knew that gave them, once that was passed, their leverage on this side, the more progressive side, the bit that they really wanted, would be lost, but they couldn't really see what they've been fighting is conservatives or more moderates within their own party. We'll talk more about that, I know. And so there was something of an impasse really within the Democratic Party, in not so much on the Republican side. In fact, the infrastructure bill was passed with some Republican support. Those Republicans now under immense pressure from conservatives within their own party. So we're talking about factions within factions, but basically this is the climate, the sort of more progressive agenda that part of President Biden's promise in his election campaign, and he's trying to push that through. They're hoping to try and do that this month. Of course, the window of opportunity for Democrats is relatively narrow because the thinking is that the closer you get to the midterms next year, just under a year from now, that window of opportunity to push through potentially controversial legislation gets slimmer and slimmer. So this is pretty high stakes stuff, and they've been talking huge numbers. I mean, these, albeit enormous numbers, were much larger when progressives started, and they've been whittled away. What they really face is a challenge in the Senate, where the Democratic margin is even narrower than it is in the House. It's basically 50-50 with the US Vice President, Kamala Harris, giving the deciding vote. But they don't have all Democrats in the Senate in favor of the more progressive elements of this BBB legislation. So that's the challenge they face. And it's been a constant negotiation mostly within the Democratic Party. Republicans don't like large swathes of particularly this legislation. Some, as I said, just over a dozen went along with the infrastructure bill, but there's no Republican support for much of what's in this legislation. So Dems really need everybody on board, particularly in the Senate, to get this through, and that's where they are.
On the face of it, I mean, I think it is often said that a president just has 2 years in which to pass legislation because of the midterms. Let's look at those divisions in just a second and look at some of the personalities involved and say what that says about the Democratic Party at the moment. But Tom, just to stand back for a minute, can you think a president who's passed such a large bill in recent times, so soon after taking office, Tom? Can you think of a comparison to that? I mean, it is pretty impressive just in and of itself.
Obama with the Affordable Care Act, right? That was the most recent president to, within the first 2 years, pass a significant piece of legislation, something that no president, not even FDR or Lyndon Johnson, could get through Congress, a major health insurance package. So, there's Obama. Clinton tried to get a health care package through, health care package, and he failed. Reagan, perhaps. Reagan's first 100 days was very productive. Tax cuts, defense spending increases, and some custom to domestic
I
programs.
mean, that gives you some context, doesn't it? I mean, that actually shows in terms of the size of this spending, it is really significant. So you would think that there was a significant amount of political credit that would go with it. But Tom, just on those polling numbers, just say briefly where they are at the moment, his approval ratings, both in terms of him as a president and also on the economy as well.
Right. So his approval ratings, based on polls from the Washington Post, the Washington Post, NBC, and Wall Street Journal, they're low. There's no other way to put it. He has been sliding considerably since the early part of the summer, and he's now right around 41%. But what's really depressing from Biden's point of view is that in 8 states that one would consider swing, those 8 states would be, let's see, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Florida, Georgia, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He's at 33%.
Yeah, it's
right?
pretty bad.
That's
pretty
bad.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And in a generic poll question, which the pollster asks, if a congressional election were held today, would you be more likely to vote for a Democrat or a Republican? The Democrats do poorly. On that one, they're down to only 41% of voters are willing to go with a Democrat.
Okay.
Which speaks loudly to how bad things are for the Democrats.
Okay. I'm going to come back to you, Malcolm, and talk about Congress and the divisions in that in just a second. But another thought's coming to my head. You are in Virginia, and I think we should say, as a mark of how bad things are, I mean, when we did our election series, we talked about Virginia, the possibility of some move on the suburbs towards the Democrats. Not a bit of it this time, and also New Jersey as well. New Jersey almost lost. Just tell us about those 2 gubernatorial races.
Yes, gubernatorial, obviously referring to the governor's races in both New Jersey and the Commonwealth of Virginia, my home state, as it happens, and from where I'm speaking to you. And they were pretty indicative of just what Tom was talking about. So here we had Terry McAuliffe, a former governor, trying to get another run in, another spell in the governor's mansion, the Democrat, going up against a political newcomer, albeit a very wealthy political newcomer who was able to reach into his own pockets and finance part of his campaign, Glenn Youngkin. Now this in a state where Joe Biden won by 10 points, Youngkin got almost a 2-point lead and won. So that was seen here as a sign that those suburban, independent, more moderate voters that we talked a lot about during the election race had swung back towards Republicans. And Glenn Youngkin ran a pretty, obviously successful, but also pretty smart campaign. The McAuliffe team was trying to portray him as just another Trump. He managed to do this difficult dance where he managed to keep the MAGA brigade basically on board and sufficiently excited, but without having Donald Trump on the stump with him. Trump sort of joined some of his own election-related events, but virtually he wasn't on the podium with Glenn Youngkin, which might have scared away some of those more moderate voices. So that was a pretty masterful campaign and obviously successful. The Dems totally failed to portray him as a Trumpian. They also scored something of an own goal from their perspective, where Youngkin really managed to leverage the education debate here in Virginia, where parents, some of them out in the suburbs where all the votes are, or many of the votes are, were up in arms about some of the mask mandates, COVID vaccination mandates. Terry McAuliffe gave them a gift during a debate where he said words to the effect of parents shouldn't really be involved in what their children are taught, which needless to say took about 2 nanoseconds for that to appear in a election campaign ad for the Youngkin campaign. So, and then meanwhile in New Jersey, a real squeaker, normally New Jersey, solidly Democratic. The incumbent governor there just managed to squeak a victory. So that was also seen of some of the same play. And you also had a very senior Democrat in the House of Delegates in New Jersey defeated by a truck driver who had, I think, spent in the hundreds of dollars on his campaign and basically just recorded his campaign ads on his iPhone, and also another political novice newcomer. So all of those were sort of red warning signs flashing in Democratic headquarters as harbingers of certainly the difficult times that the president faces and that they may continue to face in the midterms coming up.
I mean, I'm really perplexed here. I mean, it seems to me that the Republicans are the outsiders. The swamp is there still, and the resonance of the Republican message is far stronger than the Democratic one. I'm struggling to understand how this can be the case just a year in, just less than a year after being elected. So tell us what are the divisions in Congress? Why is there lack of unity among the Democrats? It seems to me that the Republicans have got a pretty clear message that's appealing to people. Just give us an idea of those divisions within Congress. Start where maybe in the House.
Well, in the House, you've got progressives who feel that the election campaign was a mandate for their progressive agenda. Joe Biden campaigned as a kind of a moderate, unifying voice, but actually when he came into office, many critics say he actually leaned towards the progressives more than they had expected. So they felt their oats. They know, the election timetable is such that, as Tom was just saying, if you want to get the big controversial stuff through, you have to do it early. So they were there at the table, knives and forks and napkins at the ready, trying to get their stuff through. But then on the other end, you've got these conservative Democrats, again, sort of partly around where I am. You've got a member of Congress, Abigail Spanberger, who's a former member of the intelligence community. These are much more conservative voices. And these are people that Dems had gone out and recruited to try and counter Republican advantages in some of the exurbs, the suburbs, and with more conservative, moderate voters. So you have these two blocks of people who've come in and they've seen the election results in very different ways. The more moderate voices, if they want to get re-elected, can't go along with this more progressive, left-leaning agenda. The progressives know that if they ever want to get some of their hot ticket items through, now they'll never get a better time than now. So that's the essential clash on the Democratic side.
Yeah, for me, I guess the part of the question is, who owns the middle ground? I mean, you're talking about sort of polar opposite. You've got sort of progressive Democrats on the one side, and then the Republicans have got a sort of, still the sort of Trumpian message. But where are those voters going? And maybe I should come back to Tom for that. But give us a take on that, Malcolm.
I think part of the problem that and I hope this answers your question, part of the problem that the Biden administration has found that, they came in, they had an agenda that was set out in the election campaign, and they set it up, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the worries and concerns and the reality of what people are facing right now. You've got 30-year record inflation. That wasn't obviously part of his election campaign. It wasn't envisaged at the time that they were having those debates. So to some extent, I think some of the Democratic priorities may seem at odds with the concerns of people right now. Which isn't to say necessarily the Dems were going to drop those priorities, but they seem disconnected from the realities that people face, where, petrol, gas is now has climbed substantially during the Biden administration. Those are the kind of pocketbook issues that Republicans can play on and say, whilst we have all these concerns and record deficits, there's going to be another contentious fight about whether to raise the debt ceiling so that the US government can continue to pay its bills. That's also coming down the pipe. So it's easy for Republicans to sort of portray this, allegedly reckless spending by Democrats, trillions of dollars, not billions even, trillions of dollars at a time when all these other things are going on and people are hurting. They go to the supermarket, buy milk, it's gone up substantially, beef is up substantially, all these staples. And those are the concerns that many sort of middle ground voters have, more than some of what's, dismissively regarded as the woke agenda of the left.
Isn't part of it about communication and ultimately the guy at the top and how he performs and how he delivers that message?
Yeah, I mean, he's not seen as he's seen, I think, fairly widely as pretty affable, but he is not a brilliant communicator in the same way that Bill Clinton or Barack Obama were, who were really truly gifted orators and who could really move a crowd. Joe Biden doesn't really have that. I think he does have a reputation for being sort of trustworthy for the most part among mainstream voters, but they don't necessarily like everything he says at the moment, and may think that his priorities maybe are sort of misguided. And of course, we've got to bear in mind that even if you pass $1 trillion infrastructure spending, bridges don't pop up overnight. So any benefit accrued from that is going to be slow. It takes a while to build the roads, the trains,
It's still remote. It's still in Washington. It's still politicians, playing around with things.
Right.
Tom, can you just talk about, because we spoke about this a bit earlier, that the two, whilst in Congress, the previous bill was got through with 13 Republican members, which would, I think, show a degree of bipartisan support, which has seemed to be very lacking in the previous administration. So that seemed to be a positive thing. But can you talk about the two Democratic senators, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema as well?
Yeah. Before I do that, may I just go back for a moment?
Sure.
Because we did overlook something important, COVID, right? And how when Biden took office, the nation was, and the world was still struggling with COVID. In his first months in office, he pushed through a major stimulus package, right? He had all the Democrats on board, and I don't think any Republicans voted for it. And I think that went through on reconciliation, which means he didn't need anyone else in the Senate. And Manchin, and so this is why I'm bringing it in also, Manchin and Sinema voted for that, right? No regard for the impact on the economy, no regard for what their constituents may or may not want. They voted for it. They were fine with that. No Republicans voted for it in the House or the Senate. Okay, so there was that. Then, and this is also by way of kind of adding more to what Malcolm was saying, coming out of the winter, inflation wasn't an issue. And Biden and the Democrats were struggling to get through a basic infrastructure bill, the one that Trump kept talking about. We're going to have infrastructure week. Every couple of months, it was infrastructure week for 4 years, and he never got it through. That should have been the easiest of bills to get through. There was even Republican support for it. Yet, we begin to hear from Manchin and Sinema, and then we get if we pass infrastructure, then we'll what I'll call the hard infrastructure, the bridges, the roads, the ports, and that broadband, to the soft infrastructure, which is human capital, investing in childcare, family leave, free college, junior college. All right, so those things get tied up in the inter-party conflict that Malcolm was talking about. Right, you get the progressives against, I'm going to call them moderates as opposed to conservatives. Right, yeah. So the moderates and conservatives both are kind of feeling like they are owed something out of the election. The progressives think that it was a progressive mandate. It wasn't by any stretch of the imagination. The centrists are looking at already 2022, and they realize that they cannot win as centrists on a progressive platform. Right. So the 8 states that I mentioned, there are a number of Democrats who are in swing districts who could lose their seats, whether by outright losing it in an election or lose their seat with gerrymandering, which we could talk about later. Okay, so now coming back to these two individuals in the Senate, Manchin and Sinema. Let's start with Manchin. Manchin is a centrist Democrat, but for the first time, he has a role to play that no other Democrat from West Virginia has ever had. And I'm thinking about Robert Byrd, the West Virginia Democrat who many, many decades in the Senate was majority leader for a time and who steered billions of dollars in real today's currency into West Virginia. Manchin has an opportunity to do that now. And even though he's kind of putting roadblocks in the way of both bills, the infrastructure is passed, the hard infrastructure, but he's looking for, even though this is not being widely touted, he's looking for more things for West Virginia, or things that will protect West Virginia's interest, particularly in the coal mines. All of Biden's agenda with regard to environmental, lowering the pollution going into the environment, West Virginia is a major coal producing state. not as much as it once was, but it's still important. Workers in West Virginia, even though there aren't as many in the industry, are still concerned about coal. And Manchin himself has personal wealth in coal, right? So Manchin is looking, I think, as a more traditional conservative Democrat or moderate Democrat to what can his state benefit? What can he get for his state out of what's going on? And
how old is Manchin? Just get an idea of his political career.
I think he's in his 60s, early 60s,
Okay.
right? And he was a governor there, so he was very popular. Whether or not he can win re-election is a whole other story, right? But throwing up his bona fides by standing up for coal could get him reelected to the Senate if he chooses to do that. And he hasn't made it clear yet whether he will run, and I think he stands in 2024. Sinema is in a world by herself, and both physically and mentally, I think she's out there, right?
Tell us a bit about, just to give a bit about her character, right. What's she like?
Right, so she came in to politics as a progressive, very environmentally conscious, decrying the wealth and the one percenters and whatever. She gets elected to the Congress, and then she gets elected to the Senate, and she's become this weird populist, but yet champion of the billionaire class. I mean, she has opposed taxes on billionaires. She has opposed having drug companies having Medicare negotiate on drug prices. And she has been shameless about raising money from millionaires and billionaires. Frankly, this is personal opinion, and there are others who kind of weighed in on this. She's a narcissist, not nearly as malevolent a narcissist as Trump might be, but it's all about look at me. If you look at her dress, how she the clothes she wears and hair color that changes frequently, and they're not standard colors, one could say she wants the attention. But then again, she will say, I don't want to talk to the press. So she is a very unusual political character. And whether or not she holds her seat, I think will be a function of and I have friends in Arizona and family, so I've been tapping them, but people there seem to support her because she's neither a Democrat or a Republican at this point. And she may be positioning herself to be like a John McCain, although John McCain had principles. One is not clear on what her principles are, other than look at me, right? So these two people, the Biden and the leadership in the Congress, in particular Schumer, may get Manchin on board, but it's yet to be seen whether they can get Sinema on board for this Build Back Better bill.
Yeah.
Even though it would help people in Arizona.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it does come back to question about leadership and being able to unite people around an idea. And Trump still seems to have the edge, and that seems to be pretty amazing.
Well, but I would also fault Schumer. I mean, Schumer is a reasonable tactician, but he is no Lyndon Johnson.
Chuck Schumer.
Yep,
just
Chuck
who he
Schumer.
is. Just who he is.
And I can go back in history. There are many other majority leaders in the Senate who have done far better job of corralling votes. I mean, just comparing him to Nancy Pelosi, she has her hands full with the progressives and the moderates in her party in the House. Yeah. And she's brought them together. She got the having decoupled, getting the hard infrastructure bill from the soft so that the hard infrastructure bill could pass. Schumer hasn't been able to do the same in the Senate, and I put some of that on him.
Can you just give us your prognosis now, looking ahead, Tom, for the midterms? I mean, as things stand, what are your predictions? And while we're saying it's 24 minutes past the hour, please, everyone, you've got questions. We've got tons more to discuss, but I'd love to get your questions in now early so we can start putting them to both Tom and Malcolm, please. Okay, so, Tom, just give us in terms of polling now, what are the projections for next year?
Okay, so I'll put my political science hat on and say that in the research that's been done by political scientists going back to 1900 all the way to the present time, the party of the president loses seats in the House and often in the Senate, more so in the House. And it's usually 4% of the seats that they already hold. So if you take that number, Democrats will lose about 24 seats. But that's going to be compounded this year because we've had the House districts are being redrawn and gerrymandering will run rampant. And by some estimates, the New York Times analysis, right now, based on maps that are being drawn in states controlled by Republicans will add at least 5 seats that they don't already have. The worst case scenario, and I won't go as far as to say this worst case will happen, the Democrats could lose about 60 seats. My guess is they'll lose between 30 and 35.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we can talk later again about gerrymandering. We always seem to come back to it. It seems to me the root of evil within US politics.
Well, the other is money, but we can talk about that.
Yeah. But Malcolm, one of the other fascinating things for me was that, in terms of the get out the vote, the importance for the Democrats, there's the strength and I guess their weakness is the black vote in some key US cities. And really, that's an existential argument. The argument there is that you need to vote. You need to come out. This election really matters. If you don't, the Republicans will be able to, change the rules so you can't vote. It will become much more difficult for you to vote. And if you want to have a say over where money's been spent, you really need to be here. And is that it seems to me that message is it's not in the midterms. It's not so effective. But also, I want to know about Black Lives Matter at the moment. Just give us an update on that, because that's something. Does that engage people politically? So first of all, what's happening with Black Lives Matter, and then what is happening with the black vote within the current political cycle?
Well, on getting out the vote in the midterms, it's traditionally always harder, and particularly so when you don't have Trump, for instance, on the ballot. I mean, Trump was a huge motivator for lots of people to get out to the polls, both for him and against him. But clearly on the Democratic side, it was an enormous motivator and generated huge interest in the general election. That's obviously not going to be present next year. And if you also look at the right track, wrong track numbers, which is, do you think the country's on the right track? Those numbers are really bad right now. If they continue to look anything like that, it's going to be hard to get the votes and hard to infuse voters to go to the polls as well. I think it's something like 2/3 of voters think the country's on the wrong track right now. Clearly, that's bad news for the people currently in charge. And if you have the White House and Congress, albeit with very thin margins on the Hill, that blame to some extent is going to fall on you quite naturally. In terms of Black Lives Matters, there have been there's division, there's debate right now about what the recent elections meant and where current trends are going. For instance, lots of more moderate Democrats think the whole defund the police message was a disaster for them. And there's some suggestion that in recent polls, like in the mayor of New York, for instance, a former police officer, there's interpretation that people have moved against that defund the police message in swathes of the country. So to that extent, the momentum has slightly gone out of the Black Lives Matter movement. One could argue to the extent that was a linchpin of the argument. There are still cities and municipalities where there is a debate about what to do about policing and whether sort of non-police law enforcement is the way to go.
And there are 2 court cases at the moment that must be reverberating and taking a lot of media coverage as well.
Yeah, they are, which one of the reasons arguably, certainly in the last week or 2 weeks, has been hard for and it was badly timed, given that the administration finally had something to crow about with the infrastructure bill. You had these on the cable networks, wall-to-wall coverage of these cases. You've got Kyle Rittenhouse, who as a teenager picked up an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle and went to try and guard a local car dealership and insert himself as a kind of a peacemaker medic character into civil disturbances that had followed a police shooting close to his hometown. The jury's out for him right now, and he's been a rallying cry for those on the right who said he used legitimate self-defense when he was, they say, defending himself from malevolent actors in the crowd. And then we also have the Ahmaud Arbery case in Georgia, currently being argued, not to the jury yet, but also very heavy wall-to-wall coverage. And this was the young man, a jogger, running through a neighborhood who was accosted by some white men. He ended up getting shot with a shotgun by one of those men, and they're on trial for his murder. And that's obviously deeply racially sensitive, and that's been stoked to some extent by one of the defense lawyers who's been complaining about the presence of black pastors in the public gallery. So that's always tendentious, but has been, none of the heat has gone out of that in the course of the trial. So yes, very much front of mind there.
Right. Okay. I'm going to come to you, Tom, in just a second for a few thoughts now, but let's take our first question now. We've got Simon Jackson there. Simon, go ahead with your question.
Hello, a couple of questions. Firstly, why is the VP also unpopular, and what's she actually done to upset people? And secondly, if Biden does badly in the midterms, is he likely to announce that he won't stand again? And if he were to do that, is that likely to make a difference?
Oh, golly, these are big questions. Yeah, Tom, go ahead. Choose which one you want.
All right, I'll start with the second one. If Biden does badly in the midterms, I think he's already anticipating that the party will do badly in the midterms. And he indicated in a conversation or interview just the other day that he intends to run for re-election. But I do think he will give serious consideration to not running. Partly, he's not achieving what he had hoped to achieve. Even if he gets the second infrastructure bill through, his hopes for an FDR-like presidency, where he changes the direction of the country, that's not going to happen. Now, if he doesn't run, then the Democrats will be scrambling in a 2016-like candidate field that the Republicans had, with many people coming out of the woodwork to seek the Democratic nomination. Of course, Harris will be there, but I don't think she has a lock on it. And to your first question, why is she as unpopular? Well, she's been given a number of tasks by Biden that are intractable. Go down to South America, go down to the border, and go down into Latin America and solve the border crisis, so-called border crisis. And one person's not going to do that overnight. And even though the border crisis, which I think is a manufactured, to talk about packaging and messaging, we have an immigration issue, but we don't have a border crisis. That's somewhat been resolved. The number of people coming across has slowed dramatically, but she's not given any credit for that. Whether she deserves it or not is another matter. But the other thing is she hasn't been visible to tout any accomplishments. And so she just stands as a kind of prop in the background in many events. And hard to feel anything positive about that. It's unfortunate. It's not her fault necessarily, but, and plus, on the conservative media here, they're always pounding her. So it doesn't help that most of what's out there is negative when there isn't a Democratic message machine on the media, with even I would say maybe MSNBC, that would be boosting her image. So those are my thoughts.
The follow-up to that, Malcolm, has to be is will Trump run? And if he can't, who else is there? I mean, that it really does seem that 2024 could be a colossal scramble on both sides.
Yes, although you're not going to see any Republicans. I mean, there is obviously maneuvering taking place, but no one really wants to put their head above the parapet and sort of take on Trump right now. That's not a fun place to be, and you get a fire hose of negativity. What might at best negativity, also threats and so on. If you say anything bad about Donald Trump, his supporters are vociferous and on occasion also inclined to issue threats of violence. So there are lots of people who might be behind the scenes angling for a run and waiting to see what he's doing, but he has no real incentive to rule himself out at this point. I mean, he loves being in the limelight. He's unlikely to step out of the limelight voluntarily. That's just not his MO. But just reverting quickly to the Dem side of things, you are interestingly seeing some maneuvering taking place. I think Tom's right. There's there's not a great mileage necessarily in Joe Biden saying early on that he's not going to run for a second term, because then he's surrendering the airspace to just an enormous amount of maneuvering and backbiting and all the rest, which would sap the energy of the Democrats at an already difficult time. I tend to agree with his analysis that Kamala Harris, she's pretty much loathed on the right anyway for her manner and her politics, and the having to deal with the border was what in rugby terms we might refer to as a hospital pass. It was interesting that clearly the White House were trying to throw her a bone when the infrastructure bill was passed. She was to give her a prominent speaking role at the White House. Finally, she was given a chance to say something, potentially positive and to get a bit of visibility. But on the Republican side, clearly they're maneuvering. You hear discussion about Governor Santis in Florida as a potential runner, but again, he doesn't want to take on Trump right now. The only person who's done so is Governor Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey, who's made pretty plain that he'd like to run and has made no bones really about his break from Trump. So he's in a minority so far of one, pretty much.
Okay.
Just a quick word about Trump. I think he will run, if for no other reason than to stay out of jail. Even if when the Republicans regain control of Congress, they will shut down the investigations. But the criminal prosecutions into his behavior and the civil litigation against him will continue. If he's president, he's off the hook for all of that. Right.
It's amazing. I've come back. There was a piece in the Financial Times by Edward Luce, and he talks about the Democrat message seemed to be dictated by opinion polling analysts, people like us, really, who dissect the electorate into different political groups and how they would vote, and as a result, the message is very confused. Whereas Trump has just got a single message and it pulls people together. And then a thought here from Alan Richenberg, who's one of our subscribers, a regular travel with us. And he says, he talks about the apparent acceptance of the inevitable defeat in November seems to contrast with the Republican perma campaign. So, I mean, I'm looking for some kind of explanation of it. Does it go beyond Trump? What is at the heart of this democratic malaise, the acceptance of defeat, whereas the winner takes the take no prisoners attitude of the Republicans? Tom, can you give us any sort of comment on that?
So let's go back to the question about turnout, getting the Democrats out to vote. Yeah. I'm looking at Virginia and New Jersey. Democratic turnout was not as robust as it had been, certainly not as robust as 2020. And just taking a snapshot, I kind of follow New Jersey politics. The gentleman who was the Democratic president of the New Jersey Senate, this guy Sweeney, who was expected to win, in a walk away, and he was up against a gentleman who had never done anything in politics. Turnout was so low, and the Republicans were so much more animated to vote that you get this incredible upset. It seems to me that Democrats are in a malaise, and they feel depressed by the fact that COVID is still, just like the general population, COVID is still around, and the economy is doing better than most people give it credit, except that we have inflation. And there is a messaging problem. The fact that Biden has these things, Build Back Better and infrastructure, that people still don't seem to understand, right? Individual parts of those packages are very popular. The Democrats have done polling on this, and many of the individual items are fine with most people, including Republicans, but Democrats haven't been able to package or identify them in a way that are easily understandable by the general public. My favorite Republican pollster and analyst is Frank Lutz. There is no Democratic version of him. And if there was, he would marshal Democrats' efforts behind a focus group tested message, and it would work. I mean, he is a master of focus group testing.
Tom, okay, but Tom's right about that. Just a quick.
Go on, Malcolm.
just one thing, that the charge against the Dems is totally right. What Tom's saying is that, you know, they spent so much time talking about whether you were in favor of the 1.3 trillion or whether you were a $3 trillion person, that actually they spent very little time talking to the people, talking to the public about what was contained in this legislation. So it's very hard for people to get excited about, you know, 3 trillion versus 1.5 trillion if you don't really know what that all means.
But I guess, Tom, the criticism I was talking about is too much focus groups and not enough gut instinct. You need to sell a short message, a short and sharp message.
Well, you know, the irony for me is Biden is very good with empathy and relating to people, but he hasn't been given an opportunity to empathize with people about the things that are in these bills. So he went up to New Hampshire the other day and walked on a bridge that's falling down, or, you know, near falling down, and empathizing with the need to repair bridges in New Hampshire. And he went out to Detroit and he rode around on an electric car. I would have advised against, electric truck pickup. I would have advised against that. He should have gotten in a muscle car, big gas guzzler, to show that he's in favor of American auto, you know, traditional industries. But be that as it may, if you put him in the right audience, and he does much better with small groups, and have him talk to people about the child care credit and family leave, and then use those opportunities to sell those aspects of the program, the Democrats might have an easier time. So yeah,
okay. Hillary Matthews, we can hear you. So your question, part of your question has already been asked already, but the last bit of it is the one we want to come to. So Trump is waiting in the wings, and you are going to ask. Go ahead, Hillary.
Well, yeah, Trump is waiting. Yes, you have answered most of my question. Trump is waiting in the wings, and I wondered which other Democrats might be there. I know about Pete Buttigieg, however you pronounce that name, but I don't think America's ready for a gay president yet. And what other names are out there? And can I quickly add a second question, perhaps to add to it is, we in England have had, of course, the Glasgow COP26, which
we in the United Kingdom, Scotland's part of the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland,
blanket coverage of that. But I don't know whether in the US, was it widely covered? How is Texas going to give up its oil? How is Alaska, where I used to live, going to give up its oil? Actually, maybe
that really good question there. Some really good questions. A lot there. So let's try and rattle through some good candidate. I mean, we know there are huge fields. Could we possibly talk on the Republican side first, if Trump doesn't get it? Because that's interesting to me, and then chuck up some Democratic names as well, and then we'll come on to COP26 and how that's played out. We haven't spoken about Afghanistan as another one that seems to me a horrendous thing that probably most American voters probably don't care about. But we'll push right to the side. So give us some candidates on both sides. Start with you, Malcolm.
Well, I mentioned Ron DeSantis already in Florida, clearly with ambitions. He's young, he's sort of Trumpian in all the ways that MAGA supporters would like, but he's not Donald Trump, obviously. So that's a failing maybe in their eyes if Trump were to run. So that's the challenge. You know, at the moment, you can't really win a Republican primary without being Trumpian. But if you are to then throw your hat into the ring in a primary, then you are going up against Trump. So this is a bit of a conundrum. So it's hard to see where those, you know, Ted Cruz is perennially out there, you know, would no doubt give it another go. He's tried multiple times before. Also, just going, I know you wanted to talk about the Republicans, but I wouldn't necessarily dispel Pete Buttigieg, not least because the one thing that they have managed to do is pass this transportation infrastructure bill, and that does mean that as transportation secretary, he's got this sort of vast pocketbook of cash to disperse around the country, or he'll be involved in the disbursement of that, which is means that a role that might traditionally be pretty obscure becomes a bit more prominent, and so he's being talked about on the Dem side.
I've got to say, we on the US election tour we did during the caucuses. And we saw Buttigieg speak. We saw Biden talk as well, and we dismissed Biden. We thought Biden was really bad news and wouldn't last the campaign. And Buttigieg was good, and we saw several others too. Tom, give us some Democrat names as well.
Well, so same crowd as ran, except for maybe Bernie Sanders. I don't expect Bernie to be in 2024, but Elizabeth Warren likely to make an appearance. I would expect that you'll see Buttigieg for sure, and Kamala Harris, can't leave her out, but there's the potential for sleepers. And there's one in Pennsylvania, this fellow Connor Lamb. He was a House member, won in a very difficult district out west in Pennsylvania. He is considering a run for the Senate, although I'm not sure if he's going, well, he will decide once he sees his district. I mean, his district is one that could be eliminated, or he could be put in with another Democrat. So if he runs for the Senate and wins, then he's a likely candidate in 2024 because he has that moderate Democrat profile that would play well nationally. Whether he could get through a Democratic primary is another matter, but he would do well.
Okay.
Oh goodness, that I've lost his name. The newest Democratic senator in California, the Latino gentleman, he's a possibility, even though he was, just kind of filling in, sort of. I mean, he was elected, but the possibility there is there that he could run, right?
Okay. Great. Thank you for those. We'll come to COP26 and the implications of that for the US economy and also politically. But Fran Hoffman, you've got a good question here. So let's take your question now, Fran. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just keep looking for cracks in the Republican armor. So I'm curious about Mitch McConnell's vote in the infrastructure. It seems remarkable to me that the Republican leadership split their votes on this bill. So was this simply pandering to Kentucky on McConnell's part, or are there broader implications for the Republican Party going forward?
It's Alex Padilla, I think, the name you were looking for, Tom. Is that right? Alex Padilla. Yeah. Malcolm Malcolm, go ahead on Mitch McConnell.
Well, infrastructure has been partly because it does a little bit of something for everybody, and the projects that it funds tend to be popular because, if you've got a bridge that's about to fall down, it's great when it's not going to fall down anymore. So it's easier, has traditionally been easier for bipartisan cooperation. So, and Mitch McConnell is fairly traditional in that sense, and no doubt there will be some good stuff for Kentucky in that. But I wouldn't portray the current Republican Party as this monolith. I mean, you've seen some deep fissures now, certainly, especially between the Senate on one side and the House on the other. I mean, on the House side, you've seen some of the Trumpier conservatives actually demanding that those Republicans who voted for the infrastructure bill be censured and have their committee assignments removed from them. And the Senate Republicans think that's crazy. You've seen Donald Trump going after Mitch McConnell even more savagely than he has in the past. All is not great in the Republican orbit, but it looks, it's much easier to be a Republican right now than the Dems because the Democratic fissures are more obvious and equally intractable, but much better publicized and more consequential right now because they hold those majorities.
Are things frozen?
I think Nick may have frozen there, but I think he's probably going to dial back in. So
yes,
maybe Tom and I we'll talk a little bit while he gets back to us. I'm racking my brains for more Republican challengers. It really should be easier, but no one's. The Glenn Youngkin, in a sort of dream scenario, there are those who would like to see, the Youngkin model certainly applied to other candidates or Glenn Youngkin himself. I mean, here's a man who has enormous personal wealth. He's pretty charismatic, looks good on camera. And he did, as I talked about earlier, manage to straddle that sort of difficult divide between being sufficiently Trumpy to keep the Trumpians on board, but not so Trumpy that moderates ran away from him. So, I mean, could he be in with a shout?
Possibly. The senator from Wisconsin, from Missouri, he's made some rumblings about running. And on the Democratic side, Amy Klobuchar is a possible candidate. I mean, she did it, she tried in 2020 and didn't succeed, obviously, but she'd be an interesting candidate again.
I like Amy
Josh?
Klobuchar, but I just didn't. When we saw her speak too, and I just don't think she's got that appeal on the Republican side of things. I just if you're trying to win over centrists and some conservatives, I don't know. I don't know whether she's got that appeal there at all or not. I missed out. I'm sorry, I dropped out there. I wanted to bring in how COP26 has played out. How, I mean, to a certain extent, this isn't part of domestic American policy. It's part of global. It should be. It is. But maybe it's perceived outside of U.S. politics. So I just want to know how that has been treated. Obviously, it's part of the second bill in terms of spending. But how is it playing out on the networks? How is it playing out in the media? Tom.
So I've sampled a number of the networks, the major networks, and it received a lot of attention on the public broadcasting system. The nightly news spent considerable time over the entire COPS meeting. The major networks gave it some coverage, not near the ABC, NBC, CBS gave it some coverage, so it was available to the general public. CNN, I don't think gave it quite as much. I mean, it gave coverage, and for some parts of it more than others, but it did. And the newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, did cover it fairly closely. So I think it got enough coverage for those people who are political junkies. I have to keep coming back to, not everyone treats politics the way I do or my friends do. They're not consuming news all the time. And for those who are occasional viewers of political news, they're probably not going to get as much of what happened.
See, Tom, I would say that there's been I think there's been a shift in terms of how people's lives are going to be affected, in terms of how businesses are going to be affected. And I think that's the case here in the UK, and I think it's certainly the case in Europe. And we know, for example, that the majority of cars produced on the production lines by 2025 or 2026 are going to be electric, or at least hybrid. And that's, we're talking, that's just a few years away. There's a dramatic transformation. Is there that sense of gear shift there, and then that must have a political impact as well, Malcolm?
I mean, certainly I agree with Tom. There was a decent amount of coverage. It doesn't seem to be the kind of animating issue that you would probably find in European networks. And clearly opinion polls suggest that, belief, to the extent this was a belief issue, the belief in the states that man-made climate, that climate change is man-made the numbers are not the same in the United States as they are. And, Donald Trump, to the extent he still has a massive audience here in the States, his opposition to that position is also well known. So there's a much more skeptical audience here, I think, than you would find in most European countries. That said, there is plenty of money in this bill for environmental causes and issues, but it's a challenge. You've still got the United States is a massive energy producer, producing energy in some of the carbon producing sectors. Texas was mentioned, Alaska was mentioned.
Yeah. So I guess my question is it a rallying cry? I mean, we talked about West Virginia, we talked about coal. Is it the fact that he's come back from COP26, albeit COP26 wasn't the support, wasn't the success people had hoped it was, that would be damaging for him among right-wing Democrats and certainly among Republicans?
So I think that the whatever was happening in COP26, we know about it here again if you're following it, but it would have been overwhelmed by all the other things that are happening, the economy and COVID and all that. But there are 2 points that need to be aware of, right? The irony for me is the United States has experienced incredible natural disasters that are climate related, the wildfires, the mudslides, the torrential rains and floodings, and people don't associate it quickly anyway, or even initially, with climate change. These things just happen. Oh, let's move on. And second, the energy industries, I read this, I can't remember where, have always had a heavy lobbying presence in Washington, but they've essentially tripled their efforts. So this is where I come back to the money in politics even more than gerrymandering. There is so much investment in working the members of Congress to oppose significant climate legislation, whether it's in the second part, this Build Back Better package, or any other regulations that might be coming out of the EPA or whatever, that I think Americans just don't quite have the capacity or are unwilling yet to accept that the government needs to step in to provide guidance to get us out of a climate catastrophe.
Fascinating, fascinating. Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. Audrey Wolf, I can see your hand is raised. Go ahead, Audrey, we can hear you.
You can hear me? Can you hear me? Yep. So I am wondering if anybody is thinking about Adam Schiff as a possible candidate if Biden doesn't run again.
Malcolm?
He would certainly be deeply polarizing in a general election. He's totally loathed by Republicans.
Just talk a bit about him. Explain for those who don't know.
He's a senior member of the Judiciary Committee, and as such, he's been involved deeply in the investigations of Donald Trump. He's been a prominent spokesman for Dems on that. He's an articulate spokesman for criticisms of Trump on the legal front. So I can imagine he is something of a star on the Democratic side. I don't think he's got necessarily the wide, he's not regarded as having such a wide portfolio that, I'm not sure what his view is, for instance, on the environment, etc. So, he's not rounded as a public persona in that sense, but certainly a very deep, sound grasp on the legal side of things, and respected for that on the Democratic side. So not a ludicrous candidate at all, but not someone I would sort of talk about maybe in the first rank of potential Dem runners.
Okay, Nigel Harley, this is possibly our last question. Go ahead, Nigel.
Yeah, if you can hear me, the systematic undermining of local election officials by Republican-sponsored changes in state laws, is this not seriously worrying for democracy?
Now, by that, what state laws are you referring to? You're referring to electoral boundaries?
There have been moves to unseat certain local election officials who were seen to generally done an extremely good job, but there seems to be a specific campaign by Republicans in certain states to undermine these people and to make sure that they're no longer in their positions in the next election. Tom.
Yes. So again, I can't remember where I read this, but there have been nearly 100 county election officials who've resigned in the face of threats and pressure. And the people who are running to replace them, many of them are being recruited by Trump or Trump surrogates. So the thought, and go back, but just think about what happened in Georgia, right? The head of the elections office there did what he needed to do legally and morally and ethically. Trump berated him. There is now a Trump candidate opposing him for that position statewide in Georgia. Basically, it's the Secretary of State position. But this is happening across the country in many states. I'm in my state of Pennsylvania. I'm literally watching it happen in my own county, right? Where we're going to have our third head of our county's election office. There are other factors going on there, but still, it's a testament to how much abuse county election officials are taking these days, that we can't hold a county election office here. So it is troubling for the future of elections in this country when the office that's supposed to be neutral in the management and running of the election is becoming politicized.
Okay, Mark,
the only thing that mitigates that a little bit is that if the Republicans do have large victories in the midterms, I think you'll probably hear a lot less about stolen elections and dodgy votes and dead people voting and all that stuff if they start to do well again, which isn't to say that there isn't a sort of existential threat to democracy out there, but it may be a bit more quiescent, at least for the midterms, if they do well.
I am worried about US democracy. I am worried. I mean, this is partly following Trump, but I think there's a broader trajectory as each decade goes by. The politics obviously becomes more partisan. That's accelerated by social media. but also I think it's deeply undermined by the gerrymandering of the US political system of within the states. And in turn, because people are elected in so many different branches of the US system, the judiciary and in high up in state politics, it means that every aspect of American life is politicized. And for me, my perception is that it does seem to me that the United States is grounding down to an increasingly undemocratic society. I don't know if that's true or not. Am I unfair to have that perception? Am I a liberal lefty who's just complaining like everybody else? Tom?
No, I share your concerns. We are moving in the direction of an illiberal democracy, and it's terrifying. I mean, as someone who spent almost 50 years studying American government and American politics, I've never seen anything like this, where we had a president who thought nothing of basically violating constitutional principles and then denying it or ignoring the concerns that were raised about things that he did. He trashed the norms of surrounding the presidency. They're not written, so if you violate a norm, a simple one like inviting the incoming presidents to the White House on the, and as you are leaving. I mean, that was a simple one, but that out the window. So I have serious concerns about America's democracy, and I was hoping that Biden would be the person, because of his temperament, not so much because of his intellect, but because of his temperament, to restore some of the dignity to our democracy and to return to the norms. Now he is.
Tom, my problem is that there's partly that you're talking about personality. You're talking about Biden as a personality who can bring people together. You're talking about Trump as somebody who can undermine the norms of democracy. But the thrust and way of my question is that I think this instability is built into the Constitution. I can't see a way back from it. I think this is a structural problem.
Well, perhaps. All right. The norms are in some ways as important as the structural function of a structural arrangement of our
basically,
system,
if you can gerrymander electoral districts, politics becomes more and more extreme, and that's self-perpetuating.
Right. So if that continues, then in fact the system will collapse. Right, because we'll have such a polarized Congress that nothing will get done. In our conversation earlier, when we were talking about divisions within the Democrats and Republicans, and right now the Republicans look united, but being the opposition party is easy. Governing is hard. The Republicans demonstrated how hard it was when Trump was in the White House, and Republicans had both houses of the Congress. Right, so. Assuming or just guessing that if the Republicans were to win the White House in 2024 and both houses of Congress, would the government run smoothly? No, not necessarily. And part of that is there would be these extreme positions, as you're suggesting. Gerrymandered districts will produce more polarized members of the Congress, but the norms have been violated, and I fear that Congress will accede more power to the president, especially if it's Trump. He will seek it. Congress will give it to him. And the Madisonian principles regarding checks and balances will go out the window, right? And then we're in deep trouble. Then we'll have a system that's either like Orban in Hungary, or worse, that's more like Putin in Russia.
Now, if people don't get their questions in, I see any new questions in the Q&A thing. You're going to lose your opportunity to ask them because our guests are going to go very shortly. So scribble them down now. Nigel, Malcolm, your thoughts, please.
Well, I think, and to add to I agree with all of that, but adding to all of that, that politics has become, and maybe it has in previous instances of American history been like this too, but it's really become less of a clash of ideas and principles than it has been identity. If I identify as a Republican at this point, I inherently disagree with anything that you might have to say, to the point where mask wearing has become an act of political political statement, essentially. Receiving vaccination, you're actually starting, you can now clearly see in some of the numbers that, COVID deaths and hospitalizations are higher in pro-Trump areas, so those things have become, and what's lay on all top of all of that, the ability of social media and data processing to slice and dice the electorate and communicate with the electorate, not just to identify people in very nuanced and sophisticated ways that never have been previously possible, but also to communicate with elements of society very directly and in ways that are clearly designed to provoke an emotional response. And that's what seems to be novel about all of this. So you've got different layers of problem. And I totally agree with Tom's point that I think we discovered in the Trump administration that there were a lot of things that we had come to expect that actually were norms rather than laws, and that there was actually nothing to stop those norms being broken if you didn't have the scruples about breaking them.
I want to, if Isabel, if you're there, can you, I'm going to pick on a couple of people. I don't know what time. I think it may be very early in the morning in Australia, Lois Towart, if you're there. If you're usually game for a comment, I'd love to get one from you. And Graham Fry is listening too. Graham was with us on our US election tour for the caucuses in Iowa. So I'd love to get a few more thoughts. Thomas, what are the next of electoral battles coming up? Have we got any other sort of governors' races? What are the next things to watch out before the midterms?
Before the midterms, no, nothing. It would be all local elections. The next big round will be the congressional races.
Right, got it. Okay.
Whether or not the Senate will change hands. I'm just assuming that the House is going to go Republican. There is the possibility, if things turn around a bit for the Democrats, that they hold on to the Senate. It'll be very narrow, but they could hold on to the Senate.
The other question I mentioned, but I didn't follow up on, is Afghanistan. In terms of foreign policy, it seems an absolute debacle, a disgrace when it comes to the Western intervention and standing up for Western ideas. What impact has it had on Biden's presidency and on his image? Tom, again.
So obviously in the short run, it's hurt him because, as people have said, he ran as a president who would be competent, and the exit strategy, even though many people agree with the idea that we needed to get out of Afghanistan, he executed it poorly. So in the short run, anyway, I think that has hurt him. But I think by the time we get to 2022, Republicans will want to raise that issue, but more importantly will be the economic issues. That and whether or not COVID is still a serious issue in the country. I also want to throw one thing out there that we haven't talked about, and that's the Supreme Court handling a case from Mississippi on abortion. If the Supreme Court tosses out abortion, that will be a mobilizing issue for Democrats. That could be a salvation for Democrats, which is
that's
very
fascinating.
strange.
That's fascinating, but but with possibly long term. I mean, the implication for Roe versus Wade. Are you suggesting that that
could be overturned?
Yeah, it could be overturned. Yeah, okay.
Roe v. Wade. Yeah, it's on the ticket. I mean, it could clearly be overturned in this court session.
Wow. It is amazing. It is amazing. Graham Fryer picked on you. I apologize for that in advance, but any thoughts? You usually do have some.
Oh, yeah, no, it's fascinating, actually. I mean, I was slightly taken aback and, to be honest, a little bit depressed when we were talking about COP26, that it seemed to be making so little traction in the US from what you guys have said. And I kind of follow, I've been reading the British press clearly, and the Economist and the FT and things like that. And their cut on it seemed to be quite different, as far as I could tell, to the view that there was, that it was making more of an inroad, if you like, or the whole environmental thing was making more of an inroad than perhaps you guys have just said. And I just wondered if you could touch on that a little bit more, about why perhaps that the whole environmental thing just isn't really gaining much traction in the US.
Malcolm, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have a sort of Greta Thunberg character in the US who's a sort of a prominent environmental critic. But maybe, I mean, to go some way down to the road to what you're saying, I mean, on the encouraging side, for instance, I live in a pretty rural area of Virginia, and the neighboring counties having a big discussion now about whether to have, wide-scale solar arrays on farmland, and that's actually a contentious debate because a lot of people want the farmland to remain the way it looks. But on the plus side for you, Graham, there is, despite what's happening in the public conversation, private enterprise is in fact doing some of the things that will help mitigate climate change, albeit not to the extent that's probably required to keep us to the 1.5 degree target. But it is happening regardless of what Washington wants to say and do on that. You've got places like Colorado, which is having a historic drought, for instance. So even conservatives there are saying, something's happening. We've never seen a drought like this before, and we've got to do something about it. So it is cutting across party lines, and it's not totally predictable who will oppose climate mitigation measures. So there is some progress.
So we are actually planning a tour that looks at climate change with a carbon offset, I hasten to add. And that's possibly going to in May or June of this year, and that will be in the States, looking at the impact of climate change there. There'll be more news to follow on that shortly. And we are doing a tour for the US midterms as well. Hopefully we'll all be able to travel then, and Malcolm will be involved, and maybe we'll also get to see Tom as well. Lois Towett, you've got a question. Your hand is raised. Go ahead, Lois.
You've bullied me into asking a question.
I have.
Okay, the one comment, and I'm going to make it, I've made it in previous online seminars of what we've had, is that there is a disconnect between politicians and what people are doing or what business is doing. And we're seeing this in Australia. The politicians are trying to shore up votes in marginal electorates that are very anti-climate change and anti all these things, and they deny it all. Whereas business is just getting down to the business of actually changing. I mean, we've now got large industrial properties with solar arrays on their roofs. And I mentioned previously, we have coal-fired power stations that are putting in solar arrays as part of, the move from coal to solar. So it's very much, it's not grabbing the political headlines, but it is happening.
It's true. I mean, look at a landmark, a marquee car manufacturer like Ford, the F-150, one of the most popular vehicles, if not the most popular vehicle and profitable vehicles in America. There's an electric version of that. A company called Rivian is about to produce a very high-end, fancy-looking pickup truck that's fully electric. So yes, I tend to agree that the private sector and the rest of humanity that isn't in Washington is to some extent moving in that direction, but clearly not fast enough.
And if I may, the U.S. Defense Department has been moving on climate issues and labels climate change a significant, if not the #1 challenge facing the world and facing the United States in terms of preparing its defense operations for climate change. And just one other thing about the climate change and the perception of it in this country: if the Earth survives the next 10 to 15 years, the youngest generation in this country is far more attuned to climate change than the older adult, the older members of the society. It is taught in most schools, at least environmental issues are taught, and younger people were more interested in, I think, in COPs 26 than the older members of the population. So there is hope, but we just got to get through and survive so that they can get to vote.
And older voters are going to die.
Yes, exactly. That happens eventually.
Okay. On that happy note, thank you both very much indeed for the last hour. Malcolm Brown in Virginia, and also Professor Thomas Baldino in Wilkes. Thank you. It's been really a really good discussion. Thank you both very much indeed.